Hello, how's everyone doing
Hold on,
today?
sorry, let me just close the windows so you don't get noise. Sorry. Okay, now we're good.
How's everyone doing today? I'm here with special guest Bryan Caplan. Bryan Caplan is a public choice economist. He teaches at George Mason University. He is not. Uh, he is the author of probably my favorite political book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids. He writes regularly about a great article called Tough Luck, which I also recommend, and his new book coming out soon, The Case for Education. How are you?
That's the case against education and
Oh,
coming
The
out.
Case Against Education. Oops, sorry. Yeah,
But either way, great to be here.
great. So let's get a little background first. How did you become an anarchist, and your interest in economics and stuff like that?
All right. Well, I guess when I was 17, I read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, and that led me to read a bunch of other things. I read Murray Rothbard and David Friedman. And that also got me into regular economics. I learned Austrian economics before learning regular economics. Once I was at Berkeley, I learned regular economics too. So probably, like so. Like by the time that I was in grad school, I wrote a piece called "Why I'm Not an Austrian Economist." So I changed my mind on a lot of things that I learned earlier. Although, still think there's a lot of value in some of the main ideas, although not in so many of the details of what I learned early on. And, so did 4 years at Berkeley, 4 years at Princeton, and then I got hired from Princeton straight here at George Mason, right before the great George Mason Renaissance, and I've been here ever since 1997.
Cool. Yeah. So what led you to not accept for those watching Austrian economics?
Well, let's see. I mean, you have to know a lot of details about Austrian economics. So I have this paper, Why I'm Not an Austrian Economist, where a lot of it is just going over very specific claims that Austrian economists make and saying they're wrong. So, one of the big ones is Austrian economists are there are let's see, what's the best way of putting it? So Austrian economists have this view of preferences, or many Austrian economists have this view of preferences where only preferences that you express in an action count. And then they use this to say, well, you can't say, for example, that there's a public goods problem of Switzerland getting invaded by Nazis because if the Swiss are sitting around doing nothing, then that shows they don't care. Again, that may seem like a very strange view, but it does. It does first of all follows from the Austrian view, and actually, Austrians like Murray Rothbard have very much pushed to say yes, that's exactly right. You can't say, so if people aren't doing anything about the problem of the Nazis invading Switzerland, this shows that in fact they do not care, because if they cared they would have done something. So that's just one example, but there are a lot of other peculiar Austrian views that when you first hear them seem odd, and my claim is they are in fact odd and wrong. Because sort of like an even stranger one is there's an Austrian view that there's no such thing as being indifferent between two choices, because whatever you do, you'll choose one, and then that must be the one you prefer. Which again, given all the times that I've been asked to choose between a blue shirt and a red shirt, and I really don't care, and so I am in fact indifferent. I just don't care. But there is this Austrian methodological view that no, that can't be true. Which in this paper I say no, actually it is true.
All right. Well, to talk your first about preferences, if it's not revealed in an action, then how do you demonstrate that someone has it?
Well, this is one way where I think Austrians are good, where they say, first of all, for yourself, there's introspection. So right now, I know that I would like an ice cream cone if it were in my hand. I'm not doing anything about it because I'm busy talking to you, but I still have this preference right inside of me, which I know just from looking inwards at my own mental states, as to how you know what anyone else is thinking, or feeling, or wanting. You can go over to philosophy department, take philosophy of mind, and learn all about the problem of other minds. How do we know that everyone else on Earth but me isn't a robot or a zombie just simulating being conscious? it is, if someone denies this, very hard to prove otherwise. But I would say, it's obvious that other people do have thoughts and feelings. It would take a lot to convince me they didn't. And once you know that, then what do we do in order to figure out what they want? We guess, right? So some of the guesswork is based upon their preference, based upon behavior. Some of it is, of course, based upon behavior of other people in similar circumstances. Well, some of it's based upon what would I do in that situation. A lot of it's based upon reading, like what do people say about their experience, listening to people. So a lot of ways. None of them infallible, but the fact we don't have infallible knowledge of what other people are thinking doesn't mean that they aren't thinking stuff, and it doesn't mean that there's no right or wrong answer to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, what would you say to someone who, let's say, they says they have a preference, but they act counterintuitive to that goal? So I prefer to be a faithful, but I'm cheating on my wife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question.
Right?
I would say it is also, so since we cannot infallibly predict or say what anybody is thinking or feeling, this means that sometimes there will be a contradiction between behavior and what they say, and that's one where you've got to put everything together and come up with a guess. Economists in general have this view that actions speak louder than words, which is a pretty reasonable idea. Although economists do almost nothing to actually research this. There's another field, though, psychology, where there's this giant literature on what they call social desirability bias, where they actually try to document the deviation between what people say and what they do. So yeah, that's all very good stuff. Of course, a lot of times, what someone said, someone says, "I would like an ice cream." Well, then, aren't you a hypocrite for not eating it right now? Well, I didn't say that I value ice cream above all other things. So, like a very clear-cut example of social desirability bias, someone says, my religion is the absolute most important thing to my life, and then they don't bother to go to church. That's where it's, it'd be one thing if you said it's important, other things are more important, and you don't go. That makes sense. But if you say it's my absolute overriding priority and you don't go, that's where we have to start thinking maybe you're just saying that because it sounds good, and actually you do prefer football to church.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about, I guess, if you want, your book, The Case Against Education.
Yes.
Sorry. Mark Twain famously said, "I'm not going to schooling interfere." So are you talking about schooling or education? And I guess, is there a difference? Or?
Right. So yes, there's definitely a difference between schooling and education. I'm using the broader word for two reasons. One is I just don't like to be pedantic and to get into semantic arguments. Most people use the term education as synonymous with schooling. But the deeper point is that there is this whole idea that education, broadly construed, is the most important and wonderful thing in the universe. And a lot of what I want to say in the book is that it is overrated. And the fact that some people are much more interested in, say, learning about history, and other people like football. I tend to think that history is a better hobby. At the same time, I think that people exaggerate how much better, say, history is than football. So, in a way, a lot of the book is against what I think of as the ideology of educationism, the idea that this is this one special good that is so superior to all others that we should be focusing as much energy as possible on it. And that's where I say, well, it's something where, like everything else, there are trade-offs, and I think people are trading off far too much of other stuff for education, especially given that there's about $1 trillion of government subsidies every year on the side of education.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And there also seems to be this idea that I've heard a lot, where people seem to believe that if people are educated, that's the cure for everything, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the reason we have to have calories if you go to Dunkin' Donuts is because if people knew, then they wouldn't consume this stuff. But of course, they've done research and usage have actually gone up once they posted it. So education doesn't mean you're going to change your behavior.
Right. So, there's an enormous amount of literature on this about does education change behavior. I'd say that there's good evidence of marginal effects of education on a lot of different kinds of behavior. It tends to be exaggerated. In the case, I don't know about the Dunkin' Donuts study, so that's plausible. just the main thing is that it's certainly not a cure-all. Rather, it's something that does marginally change behavior in a lot of different ways. But it's just not it's just not all that it's not all that it's racked up to be, or cracked up to be rather.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. So I guess, well, so let's talk about, I guess, a democracy. Obviously, you spoke about that voters are both ignorant and they're rationally ignorant because people like having beliefs that feel good.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if we're not ignorant, I guess, do you think that would make much of a difference?
Yeah. So I think we're getting at in my book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, I talk about two problems with voters. One problem's gotten a lot of attention, the other one not so much. So one problem with voters is that they're ignorant; they just don't know the facts. So that's very, very well accepted among people who know the data, and I say that's true. That is true. But what I talk mostly in that book is it's worse than that. They're not just ignorant; they're also irrational, in the sense that it's not just that they don't know stuff, but rather they have very strange views that are at odds with the facts, even though they haven't studied the subject. So it's not just a matter of, I don't know, could be, who knows what's going on with free trade versus protection. Rather, what we really see is that people who don't know what they're talking about tend to be very staunch protectionists. So sort of the default setting for people is to be predictably wrong. So that's the main thing that I talk about in that book is people who have spent almost no time studying a subject. It's almost like there's a weird gravity where people gravitate towards some of the silliest possible views that almost no one who studied the facts would actually go along with. So that's sort of the big distinction is between mere ignorance, which is not actually that dangerous when you really think about it. So particularly, if voter citizens were ignorant, they could say, well, I'm too ignorant to vote, so I'll just stay home and leave things to people who know what they're talking about. But on the other hand, if you think you've got the truth when you don't know what you're talking about, that's where you're going to say, of course I'm going to participate. I'm going to do everything I can in order to get protectionism or price controls or nuking our enemies, or whatever other emotionally appealing story that really, when you calm down and think about it, has a whole lot of problems. Sorry. So like in the process of explaining the distinction, I think I forgot what your actual question was.
I guess how much of an effect do you think
Yes.
voter ignorance has in terms
so voter ignorance by itself I don't think makes very much difference, but voter rationality on the other hand, that's where I think it explains a vast amount about policies, sort of all the policies that people who have calmly thought about the question think are a bad idea and yet exist. So like international trade, like almost everyone who can explain the standard textbook case in favor of free trade agrees with that case. That's not necessarily true. It would be possible the people who disagree would be great at explaining otherwise, but in fact they do not. Most people who oppose free trade make the silliest possible arguments in favor of it, just along the lines of we need to keep foreign products to save jobs. It's like, so should we just keep everything out and then we'd be maximally employed, or what exactly is going on? Does this mean that you should stop going and shopping at the grocery store and grow your own food? Would that be some great way of solving your household's economic problems? In general, when I look at the world, I see a lot of bad policies, and I think that these policies are to a large degree probably mostly caused by the popularity of bad ideas about what the effects of policy are.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's interesting. But do you think? Because I think a lot of people might respond that a lot of the policies that are implemented are due less because of voters, but more because of lobbyists and self-interest groups, and that the people and the reason protectionism exists isn't because of the voters, because most voters don't vote on certain issues, but because of the self-interest lobbyists who benefit from it.
Right. That view is very common among economists. The first big problem with it is just that protectionism is extremely popular. So, most people who blame special interests have some delusion that voters are against this stuff, and yet all the public opinion evidence is, in fact, most voters are quite in favor of protectionism. Now, it does make sense to say that, but voters don't know the exact details about the steel tariff or tariff on oranges or sugar or whatever. But what we can say is if voters were free traders, politicians would campaign and say, look, like I'm going to keep out protectionism in general. They would be competing with each other in order to keep trade as free as possible. And in fact, politicians don't do this. In fact, in general, when politicians pass new protectionist measures, they usually have a nice press conference where they shake hands with the steel industry and hope to get publicity. Why do they want the cameras on them when they're shaking hands with the steel industry to raise the price of steel for American consumers? Because American consumers like this stuff. So, I'm very willing to say special interests make a big difference on the details of policy, but in terms of why it's even possible for the steel industry to go and lobby for this stuff, say it's because voters are in general favorable. So, if a politician does something for the steel industry, the opposing politician does not say, "Look at what my enemy did here. Look at him. He's terrible." But rather, they say, "We have done what Americans want. We protected American jobs, safeguarded the American economy against the Brazilian invasion of cheap steel, and so thank me at the polling places." In general, there are a lot of policies that, especially economists assume, must be unpopular because they go against most people's interests, that are in fact quite popular. So, for example, farm price supports and farm programs are very popular with Americans, whether they're farmers or not. And if you're wondering, why would non-farmers want to support programs to help farmers? Well, there's been research done on this. The typical answer is to make sure there's enough food. Right now, most economists would say to make sure there's enough food. Most stuff doesn't get government support, and the food's still there. What are you talking about? That's crazy. The point is, most voters believe something that's crazy.
Right. Yeah. Probably the biggest thing I think they believe is crazy is that big businesses are actually pro-free trade. Mm-hmm. Like that if you have free trade, that's just going to benefit the big businesses. Where I would argue that these are the most violently anti-free trade people.
I'd say something something in between. So there are a lot of businesses that are export businesses, and they're generally in favor of free trade because they're worried about retaliation from the countries that they ship their goods to. So there are a lot of businesses that U.S. export businesses do tend to support freer trade. U.S. import business, your businesses that compete with imports, those ones are of course going to be protectionist. Well, actually, among business, it's very common to have the rhetoric of course I support free trade, except in this very particular case for my industry where it doesn't work. In general, my sense is that business overall, while certainly not radically pro-free trade, is more pro-free trade than most voters. But voters, on the other hand, tend to be very simple-minded protectionists, whereas with business you get something at least a bit more sophisticated. So now, you might make the more general point of big business oppose regulation? And there, I think you're on firmer ground that big business often really likes regulation because a lot of regulation is either directly good for business, keeps out competition, or indirectly it may be good because it puts a greater burden on smaller business than on big business. So there is that. Although even that I think is a bit more complicated because sometimes businesses favor federal regulation as the lesser evil between state regulation. So if you talk to anyone in the insurance industry, they will say, look, we're not big fans of either federal or state regulation, but with federal regulation, we have to comply with one set of regulation. With state regulation, we have to comply with 50 sets of regulation. It would be easier for us if we just had federal regulation only and they got rid of the state regulation, and then we wouldn't have to worry about the state regulation. So this is another thing that people in business will sometimes say, and I think there's a lot to it.
Yeah. I also think there's one of the bad things for me about voting is, if you vote for a guy mm-hmm. who does something bad, goes to war, bombs, mm-hmm. how many voters feel personally responsible for that? They can just go to bed at night saying, well, my vote is one out of millions, and don't blame me.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
Now, if the government does something good, that's because I voted. But when they do something bad, it's the politician.
Yeah, that's right. Although, of course, a big part of it is, especially until today, more than in the past, it is very common for people to be passionate partisans, and that but passionate partisans have another easy way out, which is whatever their party did must be good. And even if their party did something that you might think is not it goes contrary to the whole philosophy of the party, but no. If Obama bombs a country, then actually that is consistent with liberalism. whereas if Bush had done the same thing, then this might be the greatest war crime ever. So I think that's another thing going on.
One of the things that I thought when reading the book is because you also mentioned like a lot of people don't know, you know, who is in office and who's responsible.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's the case, then how do they know when they vote that these people are going to confirm their ignorant biases?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's true that voters often are not monitoring politicians that closely. And actually, this is part of my story about why policy isn't even worse. You know, one thing that I think I say that in the book is before I started studying public opinion, I sat around saying, I can't believe how bad policy is. It's so bad. And after I started studying public opinion, saying, wow, I can't believe policy isn't much worse. It seems like it would be way worse than it really is. Because what voters actually say they want is often so horrible that if politicians did literally what voters asked for, then I think we might have build a wall around the country to keep out every import of every product. So as to what's going on, I think part of it is that voters are lazy, which gives politicians some wiggle room to actually diffuse the incendiary demands that voters place upon them. So politicians often will, on some will realize if we literally did what voters are asking for, it would be disaster. On the other hand, if I totally ignore them, it will be disaster for me because people get angry at me. So I'll sort of split the difference. I'll give them some rhetoric, and I'll kind of do some things that they want while not doing the more extreme things that would have really bad consequences. So I think that's a lot of what's going on, and it's partly because voters aren't paying attention and aren't trying that hard to keep politicians' line or whip them into shape. That we are in this world that is not as bad as you think, given the shoddy state of public opinion, which not the research, but the opinion itself.
Right. And I think no matter what, I mean, I'm an anarchist also, but no matter what, the politics are going to be yelled at. If they listen to the voters, they're just listening to their special interests. And if they don't listen to the voters, they're ignoring the will of the people. Mm-hmm. All right? So no matter what choice the politician makes, someone's going to yell at him.
Yeah. So I think one thing that I said after writing the book is, writing the book gave me a little more sympathy for politicians when you just realize politicians are often in a damned if they do and damned if they don't situation where if they did exactly what voters want, it would be disaster and everyone would get mad at them for causing a disaster. And on the other hand, if they ignore what voters want, then the disaster will generally be averted, but voters will say the person's out of touch, doesn't listen to us, he's corrupt. And so as a politician, you have to balance this very delicate situation where you can't afford to not listen to them at all, but if you listen to them too much, it will be very bad and they'll get mad at you. So this is what politicians actually are dealing with. After I wrote Mr. Rational Voter, I actually got a letter from a retired Virginia state senator saying, you might think that as a career politician I would disagree with you, but what you're saying sounds perfectly right to me. It fits all my experience. So I actually published that on my blog with his name redacted. So if you can take a look at it and see it, it was pretty funny.
So, Len, in terms of the government and opposing it, do you think most of the blame should lie on the people who pass the bills themselves, or the public who seems to support these bad ideas?
Yeah, I mean, so ultimately, I would say that if voters change their minds, politicians would change their behavior. So the ultimate problem is with voters. Of course, the voters have so little influence and the politicians have individually, an individual politician still probably has a lot more influence over policy than a typical voter. So I would still hold politicians responsible in the sense you didn't have to do anything as bad as you did. Or, of course, politicians could have done something much better and then just accepted that they're going to get thrown out of office in 2 years or 4 years. But again, in terms of causation, I'd say if public opinion changed a lot, but politicians didn't, existing politicians would be thrown out of office and replaced with people who do what voters want. So that would solve the problem. Whereas if politicians changed but voters didn't, then existing politicians would get thrown out of office and replaced with other group of politicians that will listen to voters. So I think ultimately voters are the main problem.
No, I agree. That's why I think when people just attack the politicians themselves, you're missing the bigger picture.
Yeah, meaning, of course, politicians could always say, "I'll do the right thing, and I'll get thrown out of office." right? And then I'll get a regular job. It's not, it's not like anyone's threatening to go and torture them to death if they don't do what voters say. They could actually go and do what voters don't want, and then take this mild consequence of getting thrown out of office. And of course, often politicians have choices that are very hard or impossible to undo. So Obama, for example, could amnesty every illegal immigrant. I don't think there's any process for the next president to de-amnesty them. So, like, if I were advising Obama, I would just say, look, do the right thing, and then it'll, yes, you're not going to have any other public office after this, but it's the right thing to do, and there's plenty of other things you can do besides be a politician. So, do the right thing, Barack. Is what I would tell him. Or Gary Johnson, you may remember, he was a Libertarian Party candidate in 2008. I always said I had trouble getting very excited about him, realizing that when he was governor of Arizona, even on his last day of office, he didn't pardon all the drug offenders in Arizona. He could have done it, but he did not. And if you'd say, well, that would prevent me from ever running as Libertarian Party candidate, yeah, well, I think you'll do a lot more good by pardoning every drug offender in Arizona prisons than you will by making your Hail Mary pass to be Libertarian Party president. So, do that. When you actually have a chance to make things better, just seize the day is what I would have told him. But
yeah, I agree. Okay. Now let's talk about natalism. You're a natalist. So am I. I call myself a misanthropic natalist. I feel, because most people I'm not a fan of, I feel the more people there are, the greater the odds I'll run into someone who's not so terrible.
No, that's a totally fair position.
So one argument, well, first, I guess let's start with your view. Because I think I remember reading that you used to not be a natalist, right? So what brought you to that?
Well, let's see. I don't think I was never I don't think I remember I was ever anti-natalist. I mean, there was of course, for most of my life I didn't think about it. Until I was about 19 or so, I just never thought about the issue one way or the other. The first thing that got me thinking about it was Julian Simon's book, The Ultimate Resource, and also I talked to the he was the intern coordinator at the Cato Institute where I was an intern, Sheldon Richmond, so he also thought a lot about this stuff. So Julian Simon in this book, The Ultimate Resource, very heavily pushed the argument that greater population has enormous social benefits, and people tend to focus only on the negatives of population, not on the positive, even though when people are deciding where to live, most people would rather live in an area with a lot of people than very few people. And this is very striking given that it's much cheaper to live in areas with very few people. So suggesting that people get some intrinsic value out of being around other people, or at least the side effects of being around other people are quite good. So this is something that got me thinking about it. Then years later, I started reading a lot about the nature-nurture question. So why do kids turn out to be the way they do? And what I learned is from research on kids, on twins and kids who are adopted, the consensus among people who didn't want to believe it is that most of the resemblance between parent and child actually comes down to genetics, not to upbringing, especially in the long run. Right. So, and then sort of a final key event was personal. My first two kids turned out to be twins. So my wife's first pregnancy were twins. It was unexpected, and this just made me think a lot more about the research that I already knew about. But having twins in my house really made me very conscious of the fact, wow, you are the kind of people study when they want answers about why do people turn out the way that they do. So anyway, I put this all together, and then finally, sort of adding on the last set of economic reason is, if this stuff about the power of nature over nurture is right, then this means that a lot of the parental sacrifice and suffering that is so prevalent in child rearing today is actually a big waste of time, or in other words, you can get the kids you want for a lot less work than you think you have to. So there was a piece that came out a little bit before my book did on the theme of soccer as contraception. And the idea of the piece was, women said, well, we already have two kids, and of course, like all good parents, we take our kids to a lot of activities, they're in soccer, this takes up almost all our free time. And then we're thinking about having a third kid, but then we realized, oh, well, if you have a third kid, then we're going to have a third kid in soccer, and then this will destroy our lives. And so she was saying, well, we couldn't really, having a third kid, no, it would just be too much of a burden. And really, like in my book, I'm just reversing this reasoning and saying, since you don't have to take your kids to soccer in order to give them a decent future, this means that the cost of that third kid is lower than what you think. And so if you are someone who is on the edge of saying, should we have one more kid or should we not, learning the science makes you realize that kids are a better deal than we would have thought. So that's sort of the story of that book.
So the view, if it's more genetics, do you think like the viewpoints people have, like you're a libertarian, you think that's genetic?
There's a good amount of evidence on this, and the answer is yes. So there are strong genetic predispositions for particular political views. Now, what's striking is there's a much smaller effect of genetics on the political party that you belong to, or say you belong to, or like whether you always vote the party line. Where we see the strong effect of genes actually on issue views. Now, this often seems weird to libertarians, as many libertarians are first-generation libertarians, and they argue with their parents all the time. So what I say there is that the research is done on normal people, right? So, so now this may mean the libertarians are just very different. But here's my story. So in the general population, if you are genetically predisposed to conservatism, then you almost certainly hear about conservatism. And therefore, like, you hear about a view that naturally will strike a chord with you, and then you hear about it, and then you become that view. If you live in a society where you're genetically predisposed to be a conservative, but there's no conservatives anywhere, then it's quite possible that your latent genetic predisposition will never be realized. Now, for popular views, especially in the past, the odds that if you're predisposed to a popular view that you hear about it and then will adopt it, very high. For libertarianism, on the other hand, in like 1950, there really might have been only 10 libertarians in the country. So this means in 1950, most of the people that are genetically predisposed to be libertarians just never heard about it. And then eventually, by the time they're 30, they just become closed off to new ideas, and then they never become libertarians. Right now, a prediction of my view is that as libertarianism becomes more popular, and especially as social networking and other things makes it easier to get access, the fraction of people who have the genetic predisposition who will, in fact, become libertarians is much higher. And it seems to me that I see this in particular. The fraction of second and third generation libertarians is sharply up. So like in 1990, when I went to groups for young libertarians, almost everyone there was a first generation libertarian. And that was when the view was much less popular. All right, but now when I go and talk to meetings for the same organizations or go to Students for Liberty, now I'd say about half, when I actually ask the students, how many of you have at least one libertarian parent, about half raise their hands. 25 years ago, that would have been maybe 5% of the people in the room. So basically, as a view becomes more popular, the fact that your genetic predisposition is more likely to actually be realized. So I think actually this all does fit. Now, many people, when they hear about this, doesn't this mean that there's no particular reason to think your views are right? That could be. Although here's the thing: it could be there's a genetic predisposition to being more rational than other people, which then leads you to different views, or genetic predisposition to being calm and collected and fact-oriented, and that could lead to different views. Right? And are there genetic predispositions to certain personalities? You betcha. Yeah, absolutely. So again, it could just be that people are born with a view that it's great to go and execute people, and that's all that's going on. But again, it could just be that that some people have a more empirical mindset, or some people are more cool-headed or less emotional. So as to whether genetic influence on political views means that you should think that your views means that you should really be worried about whether your views make any sense or not, it's not so clear.
Right. So if it's genetics, then how does a view become more popular? Or, right? Because it's, at least when I'm hearing it, it seems like when there's probably no way to persuade someone to have another view, you sort of just have to lie back and they'll either accept it on their own or not, right?
Right. No. So here's the thing. So the genetic predispositions. So, there are some people who have a genetic predisposition to be great basketball players. And if you look at me, I'm not one of them. All right. This does not mean that great basketball players don't have to practice, or to become a great basketball player you don't have to practice. It means, though, that that there are some people where they're going to be more receptive to ideas when they hear them, others are going to be less so. So, of course, step one of this is, well, are we already persuading all the people who are very genetically inclined to agree with us? And of course, for many decades, libertarians weren't even doing that. Right? So I think the internet is really helping there. So it is now much more unusual for a person that is inclined to be a libertarian, if they hear about it, to never hear about it. Okay, so that's part of it. Of course, the other thing is that like genetics can be important without being everything. So again, another thing that seems to just matter for political views, of course, is peer pressure. So step one is convert all the people that are easy to persuade based on genetics, and then step two is let the peer pressure kick in and see whether that can snowball. And then in any case, so to say that genetics are important doesn't mean that arguments are useless. Just means that it's going to be an uphill battle with a lot of people, and I hate to disappoint you, but that's true. There are a lot of people who you could talk to them for years without changing their minds on the most basic things. That's, like, don't blame me. That's just reality. I'm only a messenger here. There are many people that you could argue about the minimum wage with for 10 years, and they will not change their mind. That's fact. Sorry. So again, this doesn't mean that action is futile. What I will say is it does mean that you shouldn't feel like your whole life is a failure because you aren't 100 times more persuasive than you really are. Like, people are hard to persuade. That's just a fact. Right. Sometimes I say that, look, obviously persuasion must be hard because if it were easy, it would already have happened. If changing people's minds on something were as easy as me picking up my phone and saying, hello, I just want to let you know minimum wage is a bad idea. All right, now you know. All right, great. Okay, talk to you later. Bye. If that were the way that the minimum wage, people could change people's minds on the minimum wage, it probably would have been solved long ago. And so, for whatever reason, changing people's minds is hard. To learn that the reason is in large part genetics rather than something else. It's just telling you the reason why it's hard. It doesn't change the fact that it's hard, which every sensible person already knows that persuasion is really hard.
Right. So let's get back to the arguments for natalism and immigration. One argument that I hear, and I think it's certainly a popular one, is since most people are statists, anarchy is going to be even harder to achieve if there's just more people in the world, because that's more people who are not, libertarians, and more people is going to cause more conflict. How do you respond to that?
I would say that just based upon any model democracy that I know, the key thing is is the median position. So just having a larger population, it's not clear how that changes anything. I could imagine someone saying, well, it's not that it really makes it harder, it's just that a statist is a waste of air. And look, a person can have crummy political views and still be a valuable human being. If there's you probably know many people like this, many people whose political views you disagree with, and yet they are otherwise wonderful human beings. They're kind people. They contribute to society, so on. So I would say a lot of that is just overrating how important politics is and realizing that a person can be politically a pain in the neck, and yet, especially if they are a usual politically apathetic person, that isn't the most important thing about them, not by long shots. In terms of immigration, there's usually more of an argument of the problem is that the immigrants are more statist than the country that we already have. So they're going to make it more statist by virtue of that. That's at least an argument that is easier to understand. So if we go and import a bunch of people who are more statist than Americans already are, that will lead to more statism. That may be so. There I would say a couple things. So one of them is that while there is reasonable evidence that Americans are generally somewhat more in favor of economic freedom and personal freedom than, native-born Americans are generally more in favor of economic personal freedom than foreign-born people in the U.S. The difference is marginal. It's only a modest difference. So that's the first thing you realize is it's not like Americans are libertarians and foreigners are Stalinists or anything like that. It is a modest difference, nothing huge. Secondly, there is one big issue where foreigners are actually a lot more libertarian than Americans, and this is on the issue of immigration itself. Right? I think there's only one issue. Yeah. It is the issue of whether or not someone is denied the right to get a job from a willing employer or rent from a willing landlord based upon being born on the wrong side of an imaginary line. And something that affects many billions of people. So I take this one issue as being of enormous importance, which brings us into the next key point of a big part of freedom you would think would be like, are you legally allowed to get a job? Are you legally allowed to travel here? Are you legally allowed to rent a house or buy a house if you want to? So it is odd to me that when libertarians say, look, they're going to take away our freedom, look, their freedom has already been taken away to a far greater extent than anyone could ever imagine your freedom being taken away, and yet you are getting all worked up over these purely hypothetical harms that you think could happen one day, rather than focusing on the obvious fact that someone from Mexico is not allowed to go and get a job picking grapes in the United States. So I have compared immigration laws to Jim Crow laws or to apartheid. I think these comparisons are totally apt. And again, I think the only reason people don't buy them is just nationalism. Thinking, well, I mean, so the problem with apartheid or with or with Jim Crow is that they're oppressing people that were not citizens. They're oppressing people that were citizens of the same country. Right? And to that, I said, well, like, imagine that. Step one is like South Africa stripped all black South Africans of their citizenship and then said now apartheid. Right? Would that make it any better? Doesn't seem like it. Or like, if American blacks had been denied their citizenship and then we said, all right, so now it's okay to have Jim Crow laws. So the idea that citizenship changes something that is a horrible abuse of human rights into something that's or something that is okay into a horrible use of human rights seems wrong to me. Mm-hmm. Let's see. I think there was one other thing. Oh yeah. So now something else that's worth pointing out is that the overall political effect of letting in statist immigrants is actually much less clear than you might think, for the following reason. A lot of support for the welfare state seems to be driven by identifying with the recipients. So the largest welfare states in history, as far as I know, were the Scandinavian countries in the 70s and 80s, back when those countries were almost entirely blonde. Right? And in countries like that, the attitude is, well, of course we need to have very generous programs because a fellow blonde person would never take advantage of the system. In those countries, when they started to let in some immigrants who were not blonde and not look like them, this is when, really for the first time, arguments about the welfare state is getting out of line and there's some abuse started to have some traction. This also, by the way, is a very common story in political science about why the United States is a smaller welfare state than Europe, is just that we are more ethnically heterogeneous. Right? So we are ethnically fragmented, and people don't like voting for benefits for people outside of their group. Mm-hmm. Right? So there is a good amount of evidence that supports this, which means that even if the individuals that you let in actually are going to vote for a bigger welfare state, the indirect effect is they could very easily turn natives against the welfare state, and the net effect is unclear. Right now, what's interesting is, of course, for a standard European social democrat, this creates a quandary. On the one hand, I like immigrants. On the other hand, it's hurting the welfare state. What do I do? Oh, poor me, to this tragic choice. For libertarians, however, there is no trade-off. This is two good things simultaneously. We are letting in other people, and we're undermining support for the welfare state, which should not have had support in the first place, so it's good to undermine it. I mean, what has struck me is I know many conservatives who say they're against the welfare state until you point out that immigration undermines it, and then they'll say, well, not if, like, I wouldn't want to get rid of the welfare state at the cost of our social solidarity. That's what really counts. So, like, the social solidarity is the problem. People need to think of themselves as individuals and realize that it is more important to respect strangers' rights than to take care of them. Mm-hmm. But, anyway, not a popular view, but one that needs to be said.
I agree. Very well said. And it's weird because when I hear this view, like, well, these foreigners are going to America from more statist countries, my first response is, but they're leaving those countries. Mm-hmm. If they like them so much, why would they immigrate to a less statist one? That doesn't seem to make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to that. Of course, I think the main reason people leave countries is to get higher income, right, and to escape getting killed. This doesn't mean that so most people don't leave based on philosophical differences. So, I mean, like, I agree there's like some element of selection, but I think that it's fairly modest. Most people leave for apolitical reasons. Yeah, I mean, so and again, like, you can look at the data and see that so in the United States, the foreign-born are a bit more statist in terms of their views on both economic freedom and personal freedom, although they are markedly more libertarian than immigration itself, which I say should be a very big part of how we rate how libertarian someone is. So if there was someone who's like very libertarian, everything except I'm pro-apartheid or I'm pro Jim Crow, I would say that's a big enough exception that really undermines your libertarian credentials. Or on the other hand, if there was a society where almost everyone supported Jim Crow, but one person didn't, I would say, well, that person is, for the society, that is a very libertarian position to say that blacks have as much right to get a job or to live where they want to as whites do. So again, like on net, I would say that the views of foreigners in the United States, they're much more libertarian on one very important issue. They are a bit less libertarian on most other issues. On net, I don't see that they, at least not clear that you should say that they're less libertarian than people who are already here. Mm-hmm. But in general, since people are not migrating for philosophical reasons, I don't think that you get the most status people. Although I do think that you get fewer political activists. So people who are really into politics tend to stay behind in their home country, and the people who tend to come tend to be politically apathetic, which again to many people is another reason why we don't want them. Right? Say, well, I mean, given that you think that their views are bad, shouldn't you be happy that they don't participate? Let's see if that makes sense to me. So, look, either complain they don't participate or complain that their views are bad.
Yeah, I never understood that. Like when the Republicans are complaining about all his vacation days, shouldn't you be happy about that? I don't understand.
Sorry, don't follow. What about the vacation days?
Like the people who don't like Obama saying, "Oh, he's out there playing golf." Shouldn't you be happy that he's playing golf?
That makes a lot of sense. Again, it depends on whether your view is he needs to, he needs to do more, or he needs to do something different. So if you think he needs to do more, then you might want to not be playing golf. But if you think he needs to do something different, then you should hope he plays golf every day. Absolutely, that's a very good point. Mm. Yes, more golf for Obama. Yeah, give him a bunch of golf memberships.
I also think that the big fallacy when it comes to immigration is this fixed pie theory of jobs, right? It seems like, because people say, well, they're stealing our jobs. Could it be that the higher the population rate, the higher the unemployment rate?
Right. There's been research on this. No sign. We've had a natural experiment with a massive increase in labor supply that has nothing to do with immigration. It is the entrance of married women into the workforce, which was very rare in 1950, is very common now. So we can actually see what the total effects are. Yeah, so if you are a man that is in a field where the women are very interested, then women entering into the labor force would be bad for you. But in terms of the well-being of men in general, would it have been better if women were kept locked in the kitchen for even now, sitting around twiddling their thumbs, wasting their talents? No, it's a lot better if people are able to go and use their talents and contribute what they have, so that other people can consume. When I talk about immigration, there's a thought experiment I like where I say, imagine you had 1 million farmers stuck in Antarctica. They're farming the snow. They can barely eke out an existence, so they grow just enough food to stay alive down there. Right now, what would happen if they were allowed to migrate from Antarctica to some other country, right, where the farming conditions are superior? Obviously, it'd be better for the Antarcticans to get out of Antarctica, but it's also better for everyone who eats. Everyone who eats is better off if the Antarcticans move from a situation where they contribute nothing to the world economy, where all they do is grow food and eat it, to one where they grow more food than they eat and then trade it to other people for other stuff. Right? And this is really the case for immigration in economic terms, is immigration allows people to move from countries where the productivity is low to countries where the productivity is high. Right? And how much of a difference would that be? Most estimates are in the ballpark of it would double global production. Because so many billions of people are stuck in countries where production is very low. And if they could just move to another country where production is high, every reason to think that there'd be a large increase in global production, which could be enjoyed by all.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the arguments for against immigration are just, well, how about foreigners who want to kill us? Well, how about domestic people who want to kill us? Yeah. Can people not walk down the street now? Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. So I mean, there's been a lot of research done on immigration and crime. At least in the United States, the foreign-born have about half of the serious crime rate of the native-born. So I mean, I'm actually more scared of natives than I am of immigrants.
So. The reason for that?
Pardon?
Do you know what the reason for that is?
So again, I mean, the simple story is if you get out of some crummy country into the United States, the last thing you want to do is to mess it up by getting sent to jail. So I think that's probably a big part of it. And this holds, by the way, for both illegal and legal immigrants, because these are based upon incarceration statistics. So when an illegal alien commits a crime in the United States, he doesn't just get deported. He gets jailed normally and then deported. So they are in the system. So we can see what their crime rates are, and they are extremely low, unless of course you count their border offense as being a crime, and then their crime rate's quite high. Every single alien has committed one crime at least. But again, that is a fairly silly definitional argument. Yeah. So listen. So I can go for about 5 more minutes. So if you've got sort of like your last big questions you want to ask, maybe should we skip to those?
Sure. Let's do that.
Most urgent remaining questions.
Now I have to think. Sure. What do you think is the biggest, I guess, like economic fallacy that the average person has, and the best way, because we doesn't work and that people are rational, the best way to convince people with their own ideology to maybe change their destructive views.
Right. So in terms of harm done, it's what I call anti-foreign bias. It is underestimating the economic benefits of interacting with foreigners. This is what underlies, of course, restrictions on international trade. But it also is the main thing that underlies immigration restrictions, and it's also does a lot of harm in the third world, because a lot of third world countries don't want to let in multinational corporations, in order to invest in and run their countries. Even though there's a lot of evidence that multinational corporations are awesome, and if multinational corporations in third world countries do great things for them, and are very good at getting their productivity up to first world levels in a way that nothing else known to man does. So this is, I think, like the greatest harm in terms of both keeping immigration out of the first world and keeping foreign investment out of the third world. What are the best ways to change people's minds on this stuff? Of course, one of the best ways is just to let in a lot of foreigners until to the point where people are embarrassed to complain about foreigners anymore. I think, in practice, I think this makes a huge difference. If you could just go and let in a bunch of foreigners, then just by the usual process of people being embarrassed to complain about stuff that hurts people's feelings where they see them every day, this would make a substantial difference. Of course, that's not too likely to happen. You have to first solve the anti-foreign bias in order to change the attitude. Although there is sort of a snowball effect where step 1, let in some more immigrants. Step 2, let attitudes against immigration decline. Then this allows us to let in some more. Then attitudes against immigrants will get a little bit better. So I think that there's quite a lot to be said for that. In terms of what else can be done, so there are a bunch of standard economic arguments which are much more persuasive than nothing. So these along the lines of saying, well, look, you think that there are benefits of Virginia trading with California, right? Well, how is that any different than trading between the United States and China? Seems like it's the same basic thing. So that's a big part of it. So let's see. In terms of like other things that can be done, so there's trying to preach cosmopolitanism in general. So just getting people to think in more cosmopolitan terms. There's some again it's an uphill battle, but it does gradually I think people are being at least less nationalist, more cosmopolitan. So I think that's helping just a little bit. Like the main thing is that it's very hard to persuade people on this. When I have my students there, my rhetoric is always along the lines of, look, there's a bunch of people outside this room who think something crazy, and then there's a grand tradition of wise, thoughtful, logical people who have some very different view, and I leave it totally in your hands as to which group you want to identify with. And do you want to identify with all the crazy people outside this room, or with this grand tradition that we are all learning about right now? So it's, of course, I try to, I wouldn't say that I try to be more subtle, but I, make it more gradual. But that is the subtext of a lot of what I say. So trying to give people a new group identity, and try to break people off from thinking themselves as just being real Americans and thinking themselves as being a thoughtful, economically literate human being, right? But again, like the ultimate truth, the ultimate truth, the harsh reality is that changing people's minds is really hard. And there's no magic, there's no silver bullet, or at least if there is, I've yet to see it. Wish things were different.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Get them young. That's something that works.
Right. if I 7, I have them for life, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Well,
right.
exaggerated, but yes. So get them young, and actually, here's something that that libertarians could do that I think would make a big difference. Just be friendly to everyone, even if you don't want to be. Even if it goes against every fiber of your being, just smile and be nice to people, and like that makes a big difference. So like the classic socially inept libertarian thing is screaming at people. Or talking, screaming at people, talking down to people, being friendly, talking to people with a good sense of humor. Again, doesn't mean this is not the magic bullet that's going to mean that you're going to suddenly start persuading people in 5 minutes. But it does reduce your chance of making them hate you and never listen to anything you ever say ever. So that's something libertarians can unilaterally do, is just improve their social skills, talk to people in a friendlier, kinder, nicer, better humored way. So I try to practice this as much as I can and preach it to anyone who will listen. Be friendly, you. Be friendly out there.
No, I agree. If we understand that violence is not the way to reduce problems, I don't think yelling at people is either.
Yes.
All right. Anyway, it was great having you on.
All right. Great having you, and make sure to send me the link so I can tweet this.
Do it right after we're done.
Okay. All right. Excellent. All right. Great meeting you, Dan, and keep up the good work.
Yep. You too.
All right. Signing off. Talk to you later.